Writing in 1963, Hannah Arendt thought of the astronaut as a physical realization of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The astronaut, she wrote, was the man who will be the less likely ever to meet anything but himself and man-made things, the more ardently he wishes to eliminate all anthropocentric considerations from his encounter with the non-human world around him. Estranged from both nature and the humanist ideal essence of man, humans, all of them in different ways and degrees, became vulnerable to the desperate loneliness of the human condition, few more so than the teenage audience that science fiction films aim at. Few images give a greater sense of that loneliness than a face inside a helmet. Like Robinson Crusoe in the early 19th century economic tracts pilloried by Marx, this figure of isolation might stand as an ideal of the human condition as it now exists. The great difference between Defoe's Castaway and the lone figure spinning between the stars is that the suit is evidence of our utter dependence on technologies to protect us from the natural world from which Crusoe was able to gain a living. Lost in space, you cannot make a living, only survive. If Defoe's Crusoe was one kind of imperialist claiming his island and his man Friday, the astronaut is another. Space exploration may tend towards an inner world, a spiritual quest in a secular age as it is in 2001, and more recently in Arrival. But in a second variant, the suit protects the wearer from hostile cosmos, armor shielding from contact, but also mediating between the wearer and its environment. Arendt's astronaut wears the enabling technology of imperial striving, which at the same time demonstrates the complete vulnerability of the imperialist. The spacefarer's dilemma is reversible. The astronaut is protecting the environment against human contagion. In the same way, when eco-criticism strives to escape anthropocentrism, the better to allow nature its autonomy, it only increases the isolation of the human from its environment. The problem is that the Anthropocene is not conceivable without the Anthropos. Our world and time is irreducibly synthetic, not only as artifice of human action, but as synthesis of the human and natural forces, a synthesis which, however, evidences the rift between them. It bears repeating that just as there is no reliable or non-historical nature, there's no single humanity in play. Racism, colonialism, gender oppression, and capitalism shatter any concept of species being and name degrees of responsibility for and vulnerability to this new synthetic planet. Jason Moore proposed the Capitalocene in honor of the economic forces driving economic catastrophe. Arturo Escobar more tentatively suggests Patriarchocene. My preference, given my history, is Capitalocene. I can't pronounce this damn word. But the term risks making a division between capital as a production sector and consumers who otherwise are asked to take the blame and burden of ethical consumption. This rests on the idea that consumption is free where labor is in chains. That may have been the case when Marx wrote, but it is so no longer. Marx already distinguished between the formal subsumption of labor, where work became commodified as labor power through wage labor, and the real subsumption of labor, which occurred when the actual processes of working moved into factories, where personality, skills, the handprints of the actual worker were erased by factory discipline. Today we're witnessing a second move. Consumption has long been formally subsumed under capital. We pay for commodities. But the real subsumption of consumption had to wait for the realization of the internet. Now consumption is as disciplined as factory labor and equally essential to the accumulation of capital. The real subsumption of consuming implies that the act of consuming is subject to oversight and disciplinary functions, among whose first intimations were digital rights management. Today, it involves data tracking for all purchases and the use we make of them through technologies like Apple ID, Fitbit health data, or Amazon account details, and of course social media tracking. Like the factory laborer, all our time is mined for the maximum surplus value. Needless to say, real subsumption is subject to uneven development. Even after the proletarianization of office work noted by Braverman in the 1970s, many forms of work have yet to fall entirely under capitalist conditions. Even academics are still able to secrete moments of rebellion like this symposium into the neoliberal university. Street markets have yet to promote loyalty cards and mostly prefer cash to trackable credit transfers. Still, these ongoing processes of real subsumption tend towards the consolidation of a human. At the same time, this really subsumed human, rather dramatically, is no longer human in any recognizable sense. Capital functions as an aggressive, competitive population of cyborgs. Now, we always thought cyborgs would look like Arnie Schwarzenegger, humans with computer chips. The corporate cyborg is far, far more threatening. Vast networks of servers, routers, computers, and databases with human biochips inserted. Real subsumption of consuming moves towards the completion of a project to make capital complete. I very much doubt this project will work. In fact, the evidence is that it is crisis-prone to the point of being doomed to fail. But in the meantime, the corporate cyborg is distinguished by its utter contempt, not only for the human that it no longer is, but for the whole planet. 8 of the top Fortune 500 companies are directly involved in hydrocarbons, and the 9th is Walmart, plastics. These corporations ensure that our politicians will continue to stand blinking in the oncoming headlights of climate cataclysm like frightened rabbits because they have only a single goal: profit. Given the immutable law of the falling rate of profit, capital must ensure growth in consumption. Capital cannot exist without growth, and capital growth depends entirely now on waste product, waste food, waste pharmaceuticals to cure the obesity due to the waste food, wasted medical procedures to cure the depression caused by the junk pharmaceuticals, and growing mountains of waste product, waste energy, waste heat, fumes. Ecocide is a local activity associated with imperialism, colonialism, now with entrepreneurial wildcat logging and mining. These immense corporate cyborgs are involved in a far weightier and more science-fictional activity. Sometimes we hear the Anthropocene described as terraforming. It's not. It is terracide. The Greeks, for good historical reasons, did not leave us a word for corporations, so we can stick with capitalism. But that doesn't get us off the hook. Capital, after all, is unknown in any other species. Even though it appears to be lethal to our own, an inhuman invader more sinister than the evil Transformers that symbolize it so neatly in the movies, capital is a human invention. The robot has broken Asimov's laws and run amok. The success of capital and its client governments in maintaining and recreating the conditions that led to the 2007 global crisis do indeed indicate that that crisis is unresolved and incomplete, and that it will return very shortly. But we cannot allow terracidal cyborgs to continue laying waste to the planet on the principle that they will eventually trip up over their own bootstraps. We started up these machines. It's our responsibility to shut them down. So here's a premise for the Anthropos in the Anthropocene. Historically, we have only been human to the extent that we could distinguish ourselves from nature, which we created simultaneously by excluding it from the human. Human and nature are twin terms that up to today defined each other by exclusion. Today, however, if we wish to be human, we have to distinguish ourselves from cyborg capital as well. But, and here's the problem, that is nigh on impossible under conditions of the real subsumption of both labour and consumption, precisely in the same way that we cannot distinguish ourselves meaningfully from the air we breathe or the flora in our gut. Brodel is among the historians who point out that even with a far smaller population, the late Middle Ages saw whole forests being wiped out for charcoal for heating and cooking. We can't go back to the woods or back to nature. In the same way, with that inimitable penchant for a polysyllable, Bernard Stiegler reminds us that originary prostheticity means that we've been technological from the start, whether that starts the individual child or the genesis of the species. Nonetheless, In the face of terracidal cyborgs precipitating a massive revenge from nature, becoming human may be the only way we can build an effective eco-politics. At the dawn of the Renaissance, dawn of the modern period, Pico della Mirandola included this parable in his essay on man. Upon man at the beginning of his creation, God bestowed seeds pregnant with all possibilities, the germs of every form of life. Whichever of these a man shall cultivate, the same will mature and bear fruit in him. If vegetative, he will become a plant. If sensual, he will become brutish. If rational, he will reveal himself a heavenly being. If intellectual, he will be an angel and the Son of God. And if dissatisfied with the lot of all creatures, he should recollect himself into the centre of his own unity, he will there become one spirit with God in the solitary darkness of the Father who is set above all things, himself transcend all creatures. And the key phrase in Pico's discourse is the centre of his own unity. Pico sets humanism against pantheism, against all temptation to be swept into union with the Logos, against all mystical dispersals of the self. For us, maintaining this self is no longer, as it was for Pico, necessarily about preserving a personal individual subject. In fact, becoming plant or animal sounds like a very good idea. Science is a great teacher here, not for the things it knows, but its ways of knowing them. No individual scientist knows everything. Specialism is a motive force of scientific innovation, even though it means a quantum mechanic is unlikely to understand the cetacean songs like a behavioural ecologist. No, individual scientists only know their own patch. Science is the subject who knows, a massive, collaborative, social subject. Science is also in this increasingly like certain traditions in the humanities, aware that its knowing includes physical and digital archives that specialists revisit in search of new thoughts, and that the objects they study, from mushrooms to brains, have their own information storage and processing protocols too. The social production of science, a subject that knows, embraces therefore technologies and nature. Science occupies the place once occupied by God, which the Renaissance and the Enlightenment replaced with the historical agent man. The individual was in any case a historical construct, produced in a historic series that began by shattering the extended family and the tribe in favour of the nuclear family of the industrial era. When the first moves towards the real subsumption of consumerism under capital began in the Keynesian decades that followed the 1929 crash, the nuclear family was given the task of organising consumption. It began to fall apart under the pressure, with the wave of divorce that crashed over the 1960s. The individual really came into its own as a peak achievement of neoliberalism in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis. But the epidemic of mental illness overtaking the West demonstrates that the individual, too, is crumbling as an institution. Back in the structuralist heyday from the 1950s to the 1970s, radicals called for an end to the Cartesian subject. Be careful what you wish for. Under contemporary conditions, we are all individuals, all schizzes, all fragmented data clouds and behaviours. The historical business of becoming human has accelerated. Another way of tracing this story is through the environmentalizations that have accompanied the work of becoming human. Since the Renaissance, notably since Luther, everything below the waist was the devil's. After Darwin, everything from the neck down was animal. After Freud, everything from the face back was instinct. Primal urges, nature red in tooth and claw, and various other organs. Bioscience now tells us that our biographies are explicable in terms of DNA and evolution. We should understand these processes as belonging to the history of definitions of environment. First, we enclosed and environmentalized the green world. Then we enclosed human skills in the forms of the factory environment. Most recently, we've more or less completed the project of turning human knowledge into a database environment, to the extent that we all trust Google Maps, more than we trust a local who offers directions. The last decades of the 20th and first decades of the 21st century have turned to environmentalizing the human biomass, our bodies, as the new environment to be mined, exploited, and to serve as a dumping ground for excess product. So, becoming human mirrors environmentalization historically as well as logically. Today, the unit of consumption is not the individual, but behaviors. Social media collect behaviors, not persons. Foucault's biopolitics is concerned with behaviors, not with disciplinary, self-motivating individual subjects. Our environment, not only what we exploit, but which we feel a duty to steward and invest in, extends to our bodies and brains. So I need to invest in my body. I need to look after my body. It's time, therefore, to negate Pico della Mirandola. It is not in the dark union with God, the centre of our unity, that we will find the goal of becoming human. The threshold between human, technological and natural has never been so permeable, and the human never so nebulous. It's almost too logical to say that the obvious next step is that becoming human and becoming environment not only mirror one another, they are the same process, and therefore the goal of becoming human is to become environment, to sever the last ties with the human exception. Accepting only that is precisely the goal of the corporate cyborg, to whom an indistinguishably human natural world is a presumption, both being merely resources to squander in the literally mindless pursuit of profit. We are not off the hook of anthropocentrism so easily. And there remains the melancholy responsibility we have to clean up the mess we made in bringing this state of affairs about. I mean here melancholy in the sense of Freud's analysis in Mourning and Melancholia, the clinical meaning of melancholia as a failure to mourn. Mourning succeeds when the bereaved finds a way to close the wound, not of the loss, but of the life that is gone. The melancholic realizes that the relationship she has with that missing life is incomplete and uncompletable, that the relation remains traumatic because there's no way to repair it. This is the condition that Benjamin confronts in that last great essay on the concept of history. Even in the messianic moments of revolution, we who are alive can never be redeemed if we do not also redeem all those who suffered and whose suffering made our world. For eco-critique, this must include not only those who died in the factories or in the colonial genocides of indigenous peoples and slaves, but the victims of past ecocides and the scarred earth of our geological extractions and dumps. We remember them because, as Benjamin says, every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism, written in the blood of those who died to bring paper and ink, food and drink to the Goethes and the Miltons. Melancholia, then, because we cannot speak on behalf of those oppressed, whose lives and premature deaths deprived them of speech. We cannot speak on behalf of the forests and animals destroyed so our cities could stand. It is not simply that we do not have the right, in the sense that we, and here I mean white Europeans like myself, are caught between the obligation to acknowledge the sufferings our wealth is founded on and the inadequacy of our discourse, the arrogance of pretending to speak for those we have silenced. Rather, it is that no speech is adequate. A melancholic politics recognizes the unhealable obligation we owe to the past. Too much of eco-political discourse concerns the future, but in the future we're all dead, and to adapt Benjamin Franklin, the only things we can be sure about are debt and climate change, two factors which cannot be blamed on any natural agency. For too many, the immense inequality resulting from the coordinated assault on the gains made by working people from the Russian Revolution of 1917 to the welfare states of the post-war consensus has created a political process without a future, and populist movements dominated by nostalgia for an imagined past. Too much green politics mimics this nostalgia, offering only a future of restored homeostatic balance that, all the evidence tells us, never existed. Indigenous peoples paid their respects to gods of place for good reasons. Gods are by nature dangerous and capricious. Equilibrium, by definition, has no temporality, no future, nothing to hope for, effectively indistinguishable from Pico's divine darkness. For our times, the challenge is not to make the future possible, but to make it possible to act now. The lesson of Benjamin's messianic time is that now is the only moment through which the Messiah can enter, and now is the only time that we can repay our obligations to the past. And the only way that we can do that is by undoing the corporate cyborg. To do that, we have to understand where such a quasi-autonomous technology comes from. Now, in the Grundrisse, Marx describes machines as dead labour, the congealed form of skills developed in common by past workers, anonymised, imprisoned in black boxes, and subjected to regimes of ownership and a commodity form of labour. Machines are where we keep our ancestors. The corporate cyborg is composed of materials, skills, and knowledge taken from the physical and human environment and forced to labour in the service of a ruling class that is in the process of sacrificing its own humanity along with the planet. Not only cultural documents, every machine that is a monument of our civilization is also a monument of ecological and human barbarism. But every machine, especially computer systems, their hardware, their knowledge architectures, their processing algorithms, and the data they store and organize, is also a prison where we keep ancestral voices. The media of perfectible communication that capital depends on, absolutely, are also the ancestors under our fingertips, literal ghosts in the machine. As a call for this conference notes, Eco-Critique recognizes that media are implicated in the ravaging of the planet, but that we need them to create politics in the 21st century. The task is therefore to liberate media technologies from the dream of perfect noiseless communication that the market depends on. Noise, glitches, interference come from natural and technical sources, environmental and electromagnetic events, frictions and pulses occurring in the operations of machines. Noise, which our system fights against so fiercely, is the sound of repressed nature and technology. Despite Wittgenstein, lions do speak, and so do hurricanes and broken tailings dams. It's simply that we do not care to understand. The future is a foreign country. The past we have always with us. It's true that we owe the future big time. Future debt is future money spent today, a major symptom of the colonization of the future by cyborg corporations who have also dumped their waste not only on indigenous lands, wilderness, but on the future. By foreclosing the future, capital forecloses or tries to foreclose the present on the model of security, by which they mean stability in a perfected homeostasis, mythologized as the invisible hand of the market. Now, courage is the opposite of security. It confronts noise as risk. Ancestors, like gods, are capricious and dangerous, and we owe them respect, especially after centuries of exploitation and imprisonment. A demonic synthesis of human machine and natural phyla rules our planet and is in process of destroying it. Ecopolitics demands a very different alliance of all three phyla against the actually existing cyborg that oppresses and exploits all three. This alliance requires that we remake the way we communicate between phyla. This is the challenge of Ecomedia today. Thank you.